please feel free to come closer to us and move around with us if you're more comfortable. Is it easy or difficult to become a sculptor in London, given the sort of the 20th century history of sculpture? You know, there is the dominance of Henry Moore, of Barbara Hepworth, but there's also, because of that dominance, there's also, I would say, a kind of acceptance of sculpture. Does that make it easier or harder as a student?
Firstly, hello everyone. I was expecting so many people. Does it make it difficult? Oh, that's a very, very good question. The expectations of what is allowed to be out and existing as a proper representation of sculptural form, it has been set by the postmodernists. It has been set by Henry Moore, Barbara Hepworth in the UK particularly, and it's also being set. Oh, that's better. It's also being set importantly by the monuments. Our understanding of statues. And this
You mean historic monuments, but what's a monument?
Historic monuments. So, well, I think that monuments, generally speaking, normally travel within the confines of the visual sort of format that's been set down already. So you have a structure, a plinth, and you have something atop that plinth. It's normally very representational of an actual person. It's normally figurative, or it's normally very literal in terms of including elements of an event, which allow us to understand the connotations, the story, the narrative that's being pushed forward. So there is this historical kind of grounding, if you like, of sculptural objects, which are more modernist or postmodernist, and then you have this historical monument-based sort of format. And so to work or to try and make sculpture, particularly if it's going to go in the public realm, you are going to come up against these understandings, which are, which permeate society, which permeate even people who don't go to galleries. They do walk down the street, they do see things, and they have been told since they were children that this is important, to the point where it becomes almost unnoticeable. And I think that's the thing for me that really kind of caught in my mind in terms of like work which can become so ubiquitous that we don't even notice it. And yet it still communicates very powerfully on an unconscious level.
The minute that I get into customs in the UK, I do, it's true, because I don't want to go through the line and stand there and be interrogated. I always tell them that I'm on the board of the Henry Moore Foundation.
What do they say?
I just sail through.
Yeah.
I just walk right through. And I do think, though, it speaks to on some level, I think, an understanding of who that is among lots of people. So I agree about that sense that everyone knows that work is there, even if they aren't conscious of it every single day, but because they've seen it, it reaffirms it. Yeah. So does that mean, what happens to you in the first few years of art school, first at Chelsea and then at the Royal College? How do you come to understand what you're going to do with your sculpture?
Oh, these are very good questions. These are really good. Sorry, these are really good. I haven't heard these questions. What happens? I think, you have to bring yourself to the college, the university, to that moment because everybody else is doing the same thing. So everybody's trying to establish absolutely how individual they are, how they're going to change the world through their ideas, and how you've never seen this thing before that they've just created, which has probably happened many times. So one thing I did was to try to push all those expectations out of my head and to just concentrate on the ideas. So what is my line of inquiry? What am I interested in? And then use that initial bit of inertia to create momentum, which leads to another question about material, about format. And again, I'm going to probably say this word a lot, expectations. So this idea of what do people think I'm supposed to do? So when I got into a sculpture school based on animations, which were actually shown in Times Square just recently, they just finished. So my concept or my understanding of what was sculpture was quite different. So for me, sculpture was anything that kind of made me think about space, made me understand my position in space, my size and my scale. So made me understand the world around me. So when I was starting off at school, I went through the animations, and that led to these experiments in physiognomy. So I was literally making these objects, these faces, to experiment with what happens if I change this little nuance of an eyebrow? What happens if I change the proportions? What happens if I create a nose here? Or, because there's this whole physiognomy kind of sub-science that has existed, and which I think we still slightly tap into, and we think that we can understand somebody based on what they look like before we've even heard anything from them, know anything about them. We have an impression of somebody, and that comes through how we stand, what we wear, all these kind of things, you know. So I basically started to work with the idea of the portrait and the idea of the bust, because I'd seen these amazing kind of incredibly accomplished sculptures throughout history in the museums, in galleries, and they're placed there as like the official account of greatness, the official image of value. And I was lucky enough to be taken to museums and things like that with my two brothers and my mother, by my mother. And I do remember just feeling like there's nothing here of me. Like, I don't exist in this space. So, and that was okay for everybody else. You don't need to, you don't need to be part of that. So when I was in art school, and again, I didn't really find myself surrounded by people who looked like me whatsoever or had a similar life experience. And so I didn't worry about what they were doing. I looked at this idea of this first question of what is a portrait? And so I started to do fictional characters because I wanted to critique and test our expectations, there's that word again, around portraiture. What if it's a fictional person? What happens if we use fictional people to create real emotions, to try and create a real connection, as opposed to creating real representations of people who exist to further their sort of fictional narrative? And that's ultimately that led into this idea of monuments as well, in terms of like how monuments are used. And so, but I remember when I first did a small plaster head. So I was very interested in materials. It wasn't marble, it was plaster. And it had a bit of marble dust in it as a kind of a nod to the understanding of what material was supposed to be. And I placed it very small, so it was in a version of the scale, so a small thing, in cheap materials, on scrap wood. And I placed it onto a huge wall, and it had one spotlight on it, and it had one screw into the wall, and it was quite low down, so you had to move your body.
Was the screw into the wall to keep it stable, or was it for something else?
So the screw into the wall was literally the only thing keeping that whole sculpture on the wall. So instead of obviously you put two screws in, when I put the first one in, I thought, oh, it's on the wall. So it was this whole thing of not giving into the pressure of how we are supposed to be supplicant to these objects and to material, and to get people to visit that work, to actually have to kind of move or stoop, so that what I always try to do is keep people engaged in their perception or their process of perception, and to try to place the viewer in I won't say comfortable, but give them an opportunity to take responsibility for their understanding of what's in front of them.
In this show, I think that feeling, this is the first time that I've seen this many works of this scale in this closed of a space in your work. I have been with some of the smaller scale works in larger numbers, right? But they're smaller, so it's different. What do you expect of your viewers here? Relative to that same question about what should you be doing? In that sense of, you wanted the viewers of the work that you just described to really change the way that their bodies reacted, by having to move to get down closer to it. What are we supposed to do here?
Well, again, this is about allowing everybody here to begin their own journey, in terms of there is not a didactic thing for me in terms of you're supposed to do this. I mean, I have created obviously a carefully orchestrated composition of works within this space to try to encourage a certain flow through the works. Now, there is no path drawn onto the floor. There is no number one, number two, number three. It's about allowing ourselves the freedom to explore space. And I think the idea of space goes to the core of what I'm interested in, to explore that space and to encounter these objects, these compositions, because to me these are abstract works, because they're not real people. They haven't just gone, right, you. Like, even when I later on have people in to be scanned or to be photographed, or I talk to people, that's the starting point. So it's really to allow people to sort of have that playful encounter almost, that kind of, I try to put so much into the work, the detail, consideration, the pose, there's the materials, obviously, they're kind of obfuscated through the surface treatment, which is this black patina to almost like make it look like plastic. But it should be this sort of discovery, if hopefully, that the viewer has when they go, well, who is this? But then you have this very prominent element of scale in this room, particularly in this room, because we have a ceiling, we have walls, so it's defined, and I want people to feel something. Like for me, the scale opens up detail, and it's almost perhaps that's akin to the sort of psychological proposition of these works. The psychological potential of these works is that you open up and you're almost, we have personal space, and personal space changes depending on where we are. Your personal space on the subway is probably different to your personal space in a restaurant. All these kind of things. So it's about allowing people to physically experience a presence, which hopefully encourages them to enter into that psychological journey of, which we often call empathy, but just to even recognize one of these figures as a character, and then to decide who that character might be or what that character might be, for me is an interesting thing when the scale doesn't match life size.
Where do you start with any of these works? Do you draw ever from life?
I scribble.
Okay.
I scribble. It's really, I spend a lot of time with my focus or defocused, my gaze is defocused. Like I work a lot in silhouette, because for me, it's about trying to punctuate through the barriers we have in our conscious selves and try and hit those resonant notes in the back of our minds. And I think silhouette kind of lasts. It's like if you look at a bright sky and there's an object in front, that silhouette is retained in the back of the eye. And so for me, I try to start with the fundamentals, and that comes down to composition. It comes down to
trying. Know what size they're going to be at the very beginning?
Now I kind of do. Yeah. So, I mean, this, we look at 9 foot tall, right? So that scale came off me I had a studio in London, and I was looking around, and I marked on the wall what I thought would be a good size. And I walked around a lot, and I'll go out of the room, I come back and I look at my mark on the wall and be, yeah, that feels right. And it was a feeling. Now, until you actually integrate volume into that measurement, because obviously just height is just one dimension. So once we bring volume into that, it changes things. The impact changes. And then we have viewing distance, because then you can suggest the viewing distance. I'm making an 18-foot work for London. And that is based off the architectural kind of features nearby.
This is the work that will be outside of the V&A East, the newly constructed expansion of the Victoria and Albert Museum out east into London, into, I would say, probably the more populous side of London now, the side of the city that has, and then, and I'm not speaking to the Brits that are here who will already know this and who are like, yeah, obviously. But for a lot of people, I think the idea that the city has expanded, that there's been a massive amount of immigration, that the city of London is not the place that it was 50 years ago in terms of its populace. And so the V&A East recognizes, I think, that the city is new. And so it's a large-scale sculpture of largely a figure that we will assume to be a person of color, on the east side of the city will mean so much more than I think, not having it, frankly.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a big moment, in all honesty.
And it's the largest work. Is this true? It's the largest work that you've ever completed?
Yes, largest one, tallest one so far, not surface area. But yeah, it's difficult to try and communicate. Until you see these things out in the world, you don't realize that they weren't there. Do you know, like, until, we'll talk about Times Square, maybe get a bit, and until you see somebody represented in a certain way, you don't realize that the expectations, another word, are not there for you to be visible. If you are included, it's a cursory sort of addition as on the edge of a painting, or at the foot of something else, a greater monument. And so just to be the sole character, to be the only reason for that thing to exist. Oh, wow. It's for me, it's very powerful. So yes, to have an 18-foot sculpture of somebody of color outside of a major museum, it makes the whole city think about what they would expect to be there and who they think is valuable and who gets to be seen.
Can you talk a bit about materials? So one of the great things I think about your process is that you're not scared of what I think of as being the classical materials. You work in bronze, you work in marbles. How did you get comfortable, or was that never a process?
No, it definitely was a process.
How hard is it to work in bronze?
Well, now that I do a lot of pointing, it's very easy. I mean, I absolutely love materials. I've had a fascination with the different effects, the different connotations, the different associations, the mental sort of or cerebral impact of a material. You know, if you just say the word lead, people think density, you think stability, you think, you know, different things, maybe malleable. You think gold, you got associations with preciousness, you got this luster, you know, even if it's gold and bronze. So, but when you say the word bronze, and especially when you attach it to representations of figures, that creates a very particular dynamic in people's minds, I think, whereby they know it's going to cost a bit of money. And so it must be reserved for people who have achieved something significant. And so my journey into using bronze wasn't as quick as you might think, because I was still trying to battle against the need to use precious materials. So I wanted, you know, I didn't do something, I was making very small works because why should I have to do anything big for them to be important? So I'd make small works claim large amounts of space. I would make inexpensive materials take up very prominent positions on plinths. You know, I was told when I went to college, you don't use plinths. Do not use plinths. Don't do the figure and don't use plinths. And so I spent a year making a plinth.
The figure I get, because you come up in a moment at which abstraction is our dominant mode of understanding. Yeah. And I think also, you know, also a dominant mode of market response at a certain time. Yeah. Very much not the case right now. But you predate that thinking and you anticipate where we are right now. But the plinth, explain the plinth. What's wrong with it?
Well, that was my question to the tutors. So what I realized quite quickly is that, you know, people who teach in art schools are human beings. You know, they're not wise sages. They're people who are trying to push their practices, and they're people who've been taught by generations before them. And so in the instance when it comes to ideas about the human form or about the use of plinths, it was because they were rebelling or had been rebelling against what they were told they should be using. So people were saying, you know, because it was figurative art, it was plinths when they were at school, and they were trying to break that apart and reform things and make their mark. And so it makes sense that if I'm being told not to do something, well, why not? I want to test that. But it just happened to chime perfectly with my interest in our understandings of value and how we can create status, even within just an object. If we remove people from this, just an object, you know, you place an onion on a plinth and suddenly we're looking at an onion on the plinth, you know, and we're giving our time to this and we're moving around and we're giving it reverence. So for me, it was about utilizing quite an obvious device, the plinth, to make us question again our expectations around, you know, not just modes of display, but the impact of those modes of display. And it worked very well with the figure and the idea of the monument.
Thomas, you just made me realize, so you're taught by the entirety of your sculpture tutor, all of your tutors, I should say, are the students of people who had been sculpture assistants to or workers in the factories of Henry Moore.
Henry Moore,
which means that those students first tried to rebel against Henry Moore, yeah, and they're following Anthony Caro.
Yeah.
And then they go, you know, there is no plinth anymore. There's only the floor. There's also the wall. There's also the elevation. There's also, you know, working in space. And so in some ways, it is anathema for you to come in and say that all of that struggle that they went through to break out of the master, now you want to go back to it. That's hard.
Yeah, they hated me. They did. They hated me. In regards to the approach to work. But I really do think that when you're in these environments, you're in art school, you cannot be beholden to, in that sense, to what's gone before. Like, it's your responsibility to be authentic. and not to try to please your tutors. And this whole kind of positive reinforcement, which can be so subtle, is a very dangerous drug. When people say, "Oh, I like that," but they ignore this, so are you drawn more to doing more of that? And I've always tried to maintain my own understandings of what I'm doing, and obviously I enjoy people saying, "Yeah, I like this," but there's enough people. You can't let other people decide what's good for you, basically. And so, and I totally get your point. Like, from their perspective, who is this young guy coming in? And you're going back to this? We've done that. But I'm like, but not in this context and not with these people. And that's the whole point. It's about looking again. It's about trying to uncover things that have either not people haven't wanted to talk about, or they haven't been talked about sufficiently in the ways that I think, and you've got to be arrogant with it, I guess. And but I knew when I angered them by sculpting a small head, and they were angry, like they were annoyed, I was like, well, I got them. There's something in this, because that shouldn't annoy anybody, and placing a figure out in space, in a public space, a normal person shouldn't annoy anybody. But why does it? On various levels, and it's not one level. So there's so many complexities about how we manage to be okay with ourselves in this world, if there's a singular kind of one. And I think when we look at things which break the continuity of power structures, it's discombobulating. It makes somebody suddenly aware of presence and of systems and of the things that we have done. Everybody here, has to learn to operate with what they have, where they are, and what people will allow them to do, in a sense. And so every time I'd make a work and place it into even just the art school environment, the limitations placed on that work or what it's allowed to be, I found incredible. Even all the animation series came from, they were just called man series, because everything before that was like, oh, this black man here, that black man there. Everything was labeled. And in the press, to me, the stories would begin with, oh, I saw this black guy, and it's like, well, what person is part of that information? It's not setting up anything that's going to give me any more information. It's just reminding me that I'm outside of the world that you see as intimate and as authentic or familiar and normal. So I'm abnormal, but it's okay because you're special, And that's the most, again, that's the other addictive drug, and it's a very complex and oppressive soup to be part of, and I've spent a lot of time trying to learn how to navigate that and learn how to also just like be aware of it. Like when I was a student, I didn't know what was going on. It was my life, and then my work was told, I make work about people, I make work about emotions, I make work about trying to be human, And again, it's this ideas of these limitations or expectations or the ways that you're allowed to exist really interest me. In other people's minds.
I feel close to you as a friend. I feel close to your work. I always wondered, though, why there were no women until very recently. Where were they, Thomas? Another really good point. And I was making work which was very particular to an experience that I was familiar with and that I was living and that I was having to deal with, on the coalface, so to speak, with people asking me incredible questions, incredibly personal questions. Is this something, did you feel as if you had to disavow each of the works, each of the heads that you previously made? It's just not being you? Was that a constant kind of refrain?
I mean, I'm apparently everybody here. I got very interested in this idea of misidentification because I've been misidentified. I think sometimes on purpose. Sometimes it's just literally, you see the facial expression is like when they realize you're not the other guy, So the work was very personal. So the idea of them being men was because I was making work about my experience of trying to, holding my head the potential for what I could be, like just to try and exist, like, so, balance myself emotionally. So have the kind of like, who am I? You got that question. Who am I? Who does that person think I am? Because they've just spoken to me in a certain way, or they just reacted to me in a certain way, which is very much against what I thought I put out into the world. And so my experience has been many years of reassuring people, or learning how to speak in a particular way in order to neutralize, almost get ahead of people, so that I can take them onto this path. And I think with the animations, with the heads, it was a beginning of my journey towards not doing that anymore, and to placing the responsibility back to the viewer. And it works in many ways, because obviously the viewer could be anybody, right? So the viewer might be somebody who intimately understands what's in front of them and feels an affinity to and a care of that character. Now, maybe because they're black. It may be because it looks like somebody they know. It might be because it's not the conquering hero that we normally have to put up with, looking over us with a foot on something, But it might be that they don't feel any connection. It might be that actually what it leads them to is like, why do I think this is just a black guy? And so I kept on making the works because I wanted to see what people's responses were going to be. And each time I made a piece, it would be imbued with more understanding from real world experiences, stories in the media, or just things I've gone through, or things my friends have gone through, my brothers have gone through. And also because I was told, don't do it. I was told this isn't sculpture. Like the first time I was commissioned to make a work back in 2012, I was told that I was an inspiration to, I can't even talk about the institution. I was basically led to believe that people wanted my work because they wanted something inspiring for people, for young people. And so this is the only time that I've actually been the model for something, the hubris. And then just before it was supposed to go to the Foundry, I received an email from the institution saying that, dear Thomas, we appreciate all the hard work you've put into this, but we can no longer accept it as it is, which just meant we don't want it. And when obviously I was very shocked. Then when I checked in with my liaison for that place, it turned out that the people in charge were concerned that the media were gonna identify it as a rioter, as a criminal.
Because this is just coming off of the heels of the London uprisings of the summer before, yeah.
Yeah, and so, in the media, BlackBerry had been vilified. BlackBerry Messenger, everything's been organized through BlackBerry Messenger. And I had a BlackBerry at the time. And I was on my BlackBerry and I was messaging my two brothers to make sure they were okay. And yet for me, someone on their phone, that's about care. It could be about all sorts of things. But the way it's seen from a particular perspective within society is danger, criminal. And then you start thinking about, well, how is this? This is how it impacts one's experience in real life, because I'm worried about these things when I'm just going out anyway, right? And I have many friends who are not worried about that in the slightest. So it doesn't come into their consciousness. So having a work be basically condemned before it's even been made, it made me want to push against that. And so I turned it into a 9-foot piece. And it's now in the Yorkshire Sculpture Park. And so I think a lot of this journey with the male figure was a very particular kind of experience and a very particular kind of story, which was I was living, and which wasn't being spoken about in a way that I felt wasn't working in the way that I felt it could work. And because everything had to be, because the other works I was seeing, it's almost like the attitude was like, we're just as good as. I too can be an emperor. I too can be a king or a leader or a 17th century noble person, right? I wanted to, with the way that I was looking at portraiture, in the sense that they weren't real people, I didn't want to be considered, if I just play the game well enough, I could be just as good as you. I wanted to say, this isn't about shoulders back, head up, foot on something, looking out across your kingdom. It's about what if we really valued those precious moments where we're just ourselves. because anybody can relate to that. Because I want to be myself. I'm sure there's other people who want to be felt they could just be themselves and be a valued human being and not have to explain themselves.
You know, it's true though. All of your works I do find to be incredibly self-contained.
Yeah.
You know, they really are. They're in a world unto themselves. They're rarely ever like, you know, they're not doing that thing where they're gazing out, waiting for you to respond to them in some way, right? They're not trying to ask the question that you're not answering. But I have to say, you know, the first time I saw the show, I kept thinking, you know, would you ever make group work? You know, I know how indebted you are and how much of a student of the Renaissance and of old master work. You know, would you ever have, you know, a piece that actually looked at several figures, like a Burghers of Calais type? Yeah.
I have done on a smaller scale, and I will be doing. And it's actually when the Tate Modern did the Rodin show, they had me do some commentary on some of the works, and I was talking about the Burghers of Calais. Yes, I did, because also I mean, again, I'm very interested in the idea of like the way that gatherings or groups of people are controlled in different societies. And you know, where I'm from in London, I think it's basically now, if there's a group of two people, I think that could legally be dispersed. Now you might want to check this, but I think they can say that is a group or a gang.
That's because it's a replacement of what had been the sus laws. The suspected laws in the 1970s allowed people to be stopped on the suspicion of suspicion. Yeah. And so, but that was always about a single person as opposed to a group. And so now the idea of massing, and that starts, you know, that actually starts around the poll tax riots in the 90s. The
poll tax riots, yeah.
Sorry, just, you know, anytime there is a moment to be more British than British, I go for it. I totally, I go for it.
No, you can have it. You can have it. Yeah, the thing that keeps me away from that is I love this idea of ambiguity. So I love that this room, these are very self-contained figures to me, but there's this sort of dynamic element here with just the proximity or the lack of proximity. Where, you know, there's again, the ambiguity of it all. With a group, it becomes kind of narrative. Something might be taking place, and I don't like closing off doors to people, and so I think it's just finding the way that group can work in a way that creates an opportunity for more than instead of removing opportunities for thought and for understanding. So you know, it could be based around composition. So the ones I've done on a small scale are based around composition. I'm working on a duo at the moment. It's in the works. First time I've mentioned that. So, you know...
Are they an interactive duo? Or
they're an interactive duo. I mean, I did a small interactive duo work, which was based on Samson and the Philistines, where I had a guy on the ground and there was a woman with a shoe above him. There are some other they're not finished like this. There's some very much more loosely sculpted works, which are just about composition and about this idea of the dynamic and also about violence. So that's a different body of work. But in terms of this, I love the openness of it, I guess. But you know, every time I said no about something or I'm not going to do something, I end up doing it. So I now realize the next thing I do will be a narrative figurative group. It's obviously it's a very involved process, particularly at this scale. So I guess things move slowly. You know, you asked me about where were the women, just to go back. Sorry, I'm very verbose.
I was going to come back to it if you didn't finish.
Yeah. I'm like that old guy in the pub who just like, So when I was making these works with the men, I was asked, like, my friends would be like, well, where are we? And honestly, my opinion was like, well, because the angle I was taking on the male figures was quite a specific narrative, and it had a certain understanding to it. And I felt like I could talk about that. And I had to talk about that. And when it came to sculptures of women, I looked at history, and I'd look at male sculptors sculpting women, and it's nymphs, it's objects of desire, it's, you know, classical stories, which are basically nymphs and objects of desire. Or you have, you know, these enactments of moments where, you know, women killing men, or, you know, because this moment of, you know, and I just felt, what am I adding? Honestly, I just thought, what have I got to add to this? Like, I don't want to be that guy because I didn't like the male sculptors doing the heroic Negro and that kind of genre. So why am I going to add to this canon of work that I think should be perhaps placed into the dustier corner of a museum? Until I can't, and I could lie and make up a story where I had this epiphany, but I can't remember when it happened. But I did suddenly have a clarity whereby I was like, I don't have to claim to understand the psychology of a woman. I don't have to say that I know this character. I can just do it the same way that I do these ambiguous male characters and just give her the opportunity to exist as a authentically created person, but people bring their understandings to it. And that's when a work reaching out was created, and that was put into public realm. And I thought, here we go. A sculpture of a woman who is based on a real person, but multiple people, doesn't conform to the media or the sort of fashion industry's idea of beauty, but is, I would say, beautiful. And it's just being herself. It's just existing, just there, taking up space. What a moment. The press went mad. They went mad. People went mad. This isn't us, this isn't somebody, this isn't UK, because the pressure placed on public works, statues, these are sculptures about statues, the expectations and the connotations and all the things that they're supposed to carry are huge in themselves, but when it's of anybody who hasn't been represented properly to begin with, that's the only one. I was the first black sculptor to make a sculpture of a black woman in the UK, and publicly. That's insane. I couldn't believe it. I had to double check when they told me. It's insane. So I'm supposed to suddenly have created every single type of person within one sculpture immediately. And I remember just thinking to myself, this is a lot of pressure, to suddenly realize this is the situation I'm in. But I felt it was so important because it was a moment where people could express or discover these thoughts for themselves, these feelings for themselves, and have a lightning rod that drew it out of them, and they could focus it out, and then the discussion could happen. And I think, in London it was reasonably polite. It was, there was a lot of discussion, and it got into the papers. And I'm just thinking, obviously about things that have happened here in the US, and I think, or Florence before the Times Square thing, wherever these works go, Rotterdam. This is not me bigging myself up. This is me saying, every time I place a work in public, it brings out what is really essential and what is really going on in those areas, in those locations. And that I can't say what that is beforehand, but I can try to create works which are not intended to be offensive. It's just a person. So it's a believable person. It's not the average anything. It's not the typical anything. It's just a person who I'm trying to allow to exist within a context where there is an opportunity for it to be seen relative to the history of certain things, and where people can encounter, meet, and perhaps develop some sort of empathy or connection or understanding of who that might be and how that relates to them and their lives.
Last public figural sculpture of a person of color, made by a person of color in London, before yours, if I'm not mistaken, with Edmonia Lewis in the 1890s. And the work, and I think this is really important, because the sculptors who have come in between, up to and including you, have largely done work that one would either call non-representational, so someone like Veronica Ryan, or have done work that has been, while public is in no way a referent to anything that might be a clue to who they are, or so one would assume. And so that space of however many 100+ years is, that is a lot to weigh on. Can we talk, I have to say, I feel like maybe this comes also from, I've passed by a lot and looked inside and just thought about the works kind of, in the weeks since the opening. And I keep thinking that I'm leading to a crescendo like with her. She's first of all, she's just gorgeous. She's so beautiful. Why is she gold? Like, what's the decision? When do you know that it's the moment to make an object in gold versus the matte? There's almost a kind of universality about that as a patina, but it's also, I mean, I do feel in some ways in looking at this show, it's like you're watching black and white TV and you're really enjoying it. You have no idea what the other possibilities are, and then somebody turns on the color. What's our choice here?
I knew I should have come up with a deep psychological.
You can edit it out for the video.
Yeah. This is when it doesn't lip sync. So I think I mentioned earlier, so this idea of bronze, like you asked me about becoming comfortable with bronze. I think perhaps at no point am I particularly comfortable with bronze, but I do understand the meaning and the connotations and the power of bronze. And the black patina was a way to not make it easy for people to be like, oh, this is just bronze, and move on. It was to make it almost feel like a plastic. With the gold and patina, there's a particular alloy that took me a long time to sort of get right. So I was aiming for something. So it didn't just happen upon it. I was aiming like over 2 and a bit years. And there's a celebration kind of, or a celebratory sort of impact, I guess, when you see something like this. And perhaps it's because I spent time, I went to the Royal College and I'd spend time looking at the Albert Memorial. And I understand this idea,
which is gold, by the way.
Oh yes, very, very gold, but it's gold leafed. It's really gold, and it absolutely shines.
It's Victoria's monument to her deceased husband, so she had to really make it like bling.
It is the defining bling in London. It's incredible. It's really luminous, and I guess this is me becoming comfortable with bronze, in a sense. Actually, if I do some therapy in front of everybody here. This is me becoming comfortable with bronze, but also taking it to a slightly different route in terms of how the impact it has. So to use it as a celebration, to have it as this shining beacon, to embrace that, to embrace the wow factor of it, instead of trying to underplay it and concentrate only on silhouette and only on certain forms, or making people have to get closer to understand, the braiding of a hair or something. This work, it draws you in, I think. You can see it from afar in a way that these don't function in a similar way or the same way. So this is one of many patinas or types of material that I use. I use verdigris as well. And I play with the way that verdigris can exist. The verdigris, if it's left in the garden or dogs pee on it or something, it creates this, hey, here we go. This good to see you too. It could have been a bad heckle, so it's okay. Working with verdigris in a way that, again, it sort of plays with our understanding of history and the expectations. So, like, when they pull out the bronze from the sea, and they say, oh, this is, and they give it an identification, give it a name and a character. So that's also what I like about this side of these fictionalized pieces. It's often what we understand as bronze. It's either green, so verdigris, or it's stripped of everything. It's this deep sort of, mottled something or other, which we then decide is really beautiful and very tasteful. And yet that would have been polychromatic. That would have been a painted, very literal sculpture. And so I like to, I guess, play with this idea of, like, this is quite a neoclassical thing to me, in the way that it's the way that, so then, okay, go to Victoria, perhaps, and just go, the way that things were fashionable at a certain time. So what then exists in our museums or in our stately homes, stately homes in the UK, in terms of, or in Florence, for example, where those are the way that we identify and remember and what's important, what is canon, what is historically significant, and what is beautiful. So by placing my fictional characters into the materials, into the external aesthetic of that lineage, it's about almost, I call it sugaring the pill, I guess. So to create enough affinity, enough association, enough linkage to these things that we deem good or great, to try to carry through the process of analysis.
Okay, I want to push that a little bit.
Please.
The neoclassicists are going back to a past that they didn't know anything about, based largely on a discovery of a very few objects that are coming out of Rome, which are copies of Greek works, right? So they're playing dress up, not trying really hard not to betray their own modernity at that moment, right? You dress all of your figures in what we would largely call recognizable contemporary dress. Would you ever move away from that? Would you ever costume them in another time? Would you ever make that less recognizable? Because interestingly enough, the idea of the portrait here is really more so in what they're wearing, how they're standing. Like that's the thing that's, that's of the here and now.
Yeah, so the first figures I sculpted were back in 2008. I showed them in Chicago, actually. And they were nude, small, like 2-foot figures of men, nude. Or they'd have like, I'd call them identifiers. So someone had a pair of shoes on, somebody had like a ring, somebody else had like a watch. All these little things that within art history, they're used to, for experts to come along and say, that must be Mercury, that must be Heracles, that must, because of these things, right? And that's kind of akin to how we operate. We are very aware of what we do and how we're trying to project ourselves. So that idea of costume, in a sense, I found it very interesting. I said I would never do clothing because it gives too much away. And as soon as I said that, I mean, literally like the next week, I was drawing out clothed figures. So that's why I'm getting ready to do these groups when I get back to London. But I mean, this is honestly, it's very true. It's a balance. I don't want to put them into costume because for me, I think that might disrupt the balance. And they're not playing dress up. I'm very interested in the composition of historical composition because it's still applicable today because composition is composition. The stance, the way that contrapposto kind of operates, is because we got the same bodies. The way that you hold your weight is the same today as it would have been thousands of years ago. Now, what's in fashion in terms of representation, that's another matter. But it does create a connection to history. Now, the other thing is, like, well, how long will, I'm trying to look at somebody here, how long will these shoes feel relevant, right? I don't know. I don't know if I care. But right now, these function as a relatable, recognizable thing. And my work isn't about trying to be permanent. These are not statues. These are sculptures about statues. They make no claim to permanence. They make no claim to linking to this illustrious past where your family can now feel like you are the nobility within, your kingdom or your. So I think that's why they're relatable, because they're not trying to be better than other people. They might be bigger than we are, but they're not trying to be better than we are. And they're not saying that they are the ideal. In fact, they're a rejection of the idea of an ideal, perhaps. So unless I were making works which are very much about history, in terms of like, I don't know, historical dress up, probably not. The first clothes figure I did was called New Drape, actually. There's a small figure, it's called New Drape, and it was just a guy in some jeans and a jumper and some unrecognizable trainers, sneakers, and called New Drape because it was about rendering the way that cloth folds and the way that drapery has been used for thousands of years to show that the skill of the sculptor, but also in order to show the significance of the individual. And for me, that fictional young man was incredibly significant to me, because I hadn't seen him represented in that way before, where he was just being himself, non-performative, at peace, unbothered, in space. And that, for me, has been a life goal. And I think my work, if anything, is a way to try to get myself towards that goal, but also hopefully give other people opportunity to experience that and to see that and to recognize that as a very, I would say, reasonable expectation within life.
That's beautiful, Thomas. I was going to say, I think we should open it up for questions, and we have one right here.
So these are not real people. Oh, well. Hey. Wow. Oh, wow. I'm trying to be human too. So this fellow here, is that face a compound, or is that if that person was in the room,
It's a composite amalgamation of, goodness, let me just go back to somebody's ears, somebody's lips, somebody's nose, somebody else. These are different people's noses, eyes, back of the cranium. I mean, it's a total mishmash.
Oh, cool.
And I like that because it kind of fits in with often how historical sculptures are found in parts and then placed together, and then they're given the official stamp of identity, and that's who they are. So the idea of creating these kind of Frankensteins and then sort of melding them all together and creating a believable individual. Yeah.
Do you do it physically, or what are there's in the lead-in, there was the intuitive digital process, or just a little bit about that?
Yeah, that sounded good, didn't it? Intuitive digital. No, so I used to work purely with my hands and clay, and it's a very linear method. I then moved towards using digital sculpting, so like digital clay, and that allows you to work in a multiple strand. So instead of having to use just one thing and then follow that line, you can do comparative works. You can take risks. You can work against, or you can see how different nuance changes impact the potential understanding of that work. So this is sculpted digitally in a 2.5D realm, where I can rotate and revolve works around and get in there kind of thing and see all the differences. Whereas before I'd have to literally I'd spend days, weeks, months standing in strange positions, ruining my eyesight. Yeah. Oh.
Hi, my name is Luz Marilyn. I'm an absolute fan. And I wonder if you have experienced pressure to represent. You mentioned you may have been the first person to put these sculptures publicly, and sometimes when you're the first or the minority, there are feelings. So I was wondering how that goes for you.
I think, God, this word again, expectation. The expectations are huge. Yeah, they really are huge. But the reality is that something has to happen first, right? Without that step, there is no journey. So, and I consider my work to be a journey. And you asked me before about where were the women, and I said it takes time. Also, you understand, the other reason that these don't just exist everywhere is because sculpture, particularly with bronze, tends to be quite expensive to make. So that in itself sets up an expectation of who gets to be represented. So it already does the stacking, as we call it in sports science, stacking. So I had to find a way. I don't come from any money. I had to find a way to find money, to learn how to sculpt, find money, because I didn't teach that at college. and then find an audience, find a place, because putting works out into the world, moving a sculpture like this costs money. Placing it on the ground in a way that's not going to take people out costs money. So that all these things are built into the practicalities of this format, which are very prohibitive for things which don't then have governmental backing perhaps, or aren't done by a huge trust for somebody's family. So there are huge expectations, because when one of these things then pops up, it carries with it all those understandings of what this format is supposed to mean and supposed to do. These are almost like functional objects out when they're statues. But like I said, these are sculptures about statues. So there's huge pressure, of course. And if I really think about it, it's a lot, but I try not to think about it, because what I do, like I said earlier, is I engage in my process of why am I making this? Because this is my life. I could do something else. Why am I making this? Why is this important to me? And I have to just trust that line of inquiry is enough in itself. And it, I've been doing this for 20 years plus. So I've learned a lot of things, and I'm having conversations with myself as well as critics or people who are being positive, or friends, or people like, where are we? I listen, but it takes time. And I don't want to make work too quickly all in one go, because it doesn't have the integration of that understanding. You know, I think slow is better. And I think also people need time to catch up. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 6 years ago, people were like, what's this about? So what? Monuments? What about them? 5 years ago, whew, you know, it's everywhere. So it's easy for me to pretend that I knew exactly what was going to happen. I knew the cultural landscape and what was going to be significant, but I didn't. I was making work that was important to me, and took a form that I felt had meaning. And I have to maintain that as my reason for doing this. And it fills me with joy when I see people when the work resonates with people. But like I said earlier, I have to be very careful not to get carried away by that. Because what happens if people everybody starts to hate this, you know? Do I stop? I mean, probably, yeah, but but do you know what I mean? It's like, it's a really weird, sorry, you brought up a lot here. It's a very strange position to be in, because I'm making work which is actually very personal, and then very public. Because I want people to have that personal reaction to the work, so I have to keep myself open to that. So it's a very vulnerable position to be in. And that does carry pressure, and it carries all sorts of emotions with it. But that's the price of entry. And I accept that.
Hi, my name is Lara. English is not my main language, so I'm gonna try to be like more clear, but I'm very interested in the process of the emotion and the psychology that you have in your sculpture. And I would like to ask, what is the most difficult or the most intriguing emotion that you work with in a sculpture? And that is the most difficult to create a relation with the viewer, or with the fragmented narration that you have with other sculptures?
Well, the ambiguity that I try and build into the expressions, that's probably the hardest element, to not have it absolutely one thing or the other. Because I don't, a smile, an absolute obvious smile in a sculpture is some scary stuff. There is nothing more haunting than that smile. And so the same with grimaces, and because this is why I love sculpture so much, because it exists in our world, right? It can do. Sculpture could be anything, but stuff like this, it can exist in our world. So we have expectations about what it's supposed to do. Like I have put a workout of somebody like in a t-shirt. I go, is she going to be cold? You know, because I'm worrying about her as a human being. But with the expression, that's a really good question. I spend a lot of time just staring. I think I said earlier, I spend a lot of time defocused. My eyes are defocused, because I'm trying not to be too specific about what is happening. And that's when I said I scribble earlier on. I said it very flippantly, but I scribble for a reason, because I'm not trying to render beautifully the finished thing, because for me, that would be the thing. I've got it out of my system. So a lot of my ways of working are about trying to find the right ending point in the right medium. And so with the expressions, people say, oh, they look gloomy, or they look, I've had this since I was first started making animations. 2001, I was told it was all too melancholic, right? Oh, he looks depressed. Should have been happier. Should have been happier. Why are you not smiling? Why are you not smiling? What looks angry? Interesting. So they don't smile because I've spent much of my life, I'm sure a lot of people in this room spend a lot of part of your lives trying to project something just to reassure somebody else that you don't even know. That emotional labor is huge, and it takes its toll. And so, as I said earlier, my work is a way for me to try and break free of that, or at least claim an understanding of that, and share that experience in a way that everybody can get a little taste of the authentic sense of being human. And so, to get back to your question, sorry, it's the eyes. No, it's trying to find that balance where you're suggesting a way into a psychology without closing the door on other potential. And so if you look, the eyes are hollow in my sculptures. And that's not because I'm lazy. That's everything else about them. But it's because I like the viewer to fill in that last stage of the psychological understanding. It's an invitation for you to engage psychologically with that work, and hopefully in a way that encourages you to have an opinion. And that's why I started using the figures in the first place. I come from a performance background. I was doing performance and video works, abstract work before that, or excuse me, after that. The figures were a way to try to connect more directly with people in a way that encourages opinion. And that's why, I mentioned before, like price of entry. It's true. Like, I can't say I want people to feel able to comment on work and then be like, but you can't say that. That's not the bargain. So for me, the most difficult part is to find something in each one. And if you walk around them, you'll see that the expressions can shift. It's to resist the outside pressure to perform and make them smile, or make them look not angry, make them look respectful. But I love the myriad of readings of these works through something as simple as shifting one side of the mouth a little bit higher than the other side of the mouth. So when you walk around that sculpture, it may seem like it's frowning or it starts to smile. Wow.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate your time. I hope that you will get a chance to see the work that's in Times Square, which is really incredible and is really a companion to many of the ideas that are expressed in the works that are here. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob.